Welcome to London Accessibility Meetup number 29. Was that a whoop? That's never happened before. Thank you all so much for coming. Really great attendance today. If you are watching on the live stream as well, welcome. We've had a few technical troubles as always, but I think we have just about got there. Thank you to Peter and Janos. If you want to follow the Meetup on Twitter, we're on the hashtag AliLondon. And we also use one hashtag actually, which is AliLondon. If you're not sure, Ali or A11Y is a kind of interesting way of saying accessibility. So it's the A and the Y, the first and the last letter of accessibility, and then the 11 characters in between. So Ali, A11Y. It's a kind of bizarre, inaccessible way of saying accessibility. I've also jumped on one of the GDS or Government Digital Services hashtags today as well, which is accessibility regulations. Today is a very special day in accessibility. I'm not going to steal Abi's thunder. I'm just going to tell you it's a special day, and we have some great speakers that are going to tell us all about it. We're also on YouTube as well. So we have about 50 videos from previous meetups on YouTube. This one is being live streamed right now, and then the recordings will go up afterwards as well. If you go on YouTube and just search for London Accessibility Meetup, you should find us pretty easily. And there's loads of great content there from I think it's the last 3 years almost now. So please check that out. A little bit about myself. My name is Andy Ronksley. I'm a freelance digital accessibility specialist. I'm on Twitter as well if you want to find out a bit more about me. One announcement today. Again, just want to do a little shout out for a website that I personally have found really useful in the last few weeks. I believe it's a GDS production. It's accessibility.campaign.gov.uk, and that's where the hashtag that I've borrowed for today has come from as well. Really easy to understand, or at least I found it easy to understand website that kind of complements what we're going to talk about today, which is these new accessibility regulations that are coming into effect or force today. Not quite sure which is the right word to use. So yeah, check that out. It's a good resource. We're going to use the Wi-Fi today. O2 Wi-Fi is the network to connect to. You will need to give it some details like name, address, etc. But yeah, they should be able to connect to O2 Wi-Fi. We also use a platform for asking questions. So we have mics if you want to ask a question in the room. But if you'd rather ask a question via your phone, or if you're on the live stream and you want to ask a question remotely, then go to slido.com on your phone, laptop, and enter the code for today, which is K209. That will connect you to the room we've got set up for today. First time today as well, we're also using polls. So Abi and Sarah are going to be using polls today. So if you want to interact with the polls we're going to be running today, try and get connected to slido.com now. And there should be some polls there that we can look at shortly. Quick hands up exercise, just to kind of get a feel for who's in the room. So who's working in digital accessibility? Probably about 3/4 of the room. Anyone working in another type of accessibility, so like physical accessibility, product accessibility maybe? Handful, about 5. Okay, who's government? Probably about half. Corporate? A 1/4. Charities, third sector? Okay, about a 1/4 as well. Okay, designers? About half. Developers, maybe about a 1/3. Accessibility specialists, that'll probably be me, about a 1/3. Some people must be in numerous categories. What else? Content, thank you. Okay, probably about a 1/3 as well. Education. Okay. Yeah, come on. Did I miss any? Agencies. Policy, yeah, okay. Okay, nice mix of people in the room. So I hope you all get a chance to make benefit of the networking in the breaks. Okay, the agenda for tonight. We've got 2 great speakers lined up. First of all, Abi James from AbilityNet is going to be talking about digital accessibility regulatory landscape. Are you ready? Hopefully we'll have the answer. And then following up after the break, we've got Dr. Sarah Lewthwaite from the University of Southampton, who's going to be talking about learning and teaching accessibility. Afterwards, if you want to, I'm not sure if any of the organising team are going to the pub today. I have to bail out, unfortunately. But if you do want to go to the pub afterwards, there is one just around the corner. It's called Sir Christopher Hatton. It's about a 2-3 minute walk away. So you come out the front door of Sainsbury's and take a left. You walk up the main road for about a minute, and then you cross over the road, and the pub is pretty much there. It's fairly quiet. You can have a conversation. So it's quite a good place to hang out if any of you want to afterwards. Before we get started, just a quick thank you to all the sponsors. So Sainsbury's, first of all, provide this amazing venue for us, and they help us with the refreshments as well. So please give a round of applause for Sainsbury's. And then Barclays Access have sponsored the Meetup for the entire year. The money that Barclays give us allows us to do the pizzas and drinks, and also to pay for things like live captions, and to pay for the guys to record the events for us and put them on YouTube, etc. So it just makes the events a lot more professional, means a lot more people can enjoy them on the day and after the day as well. So round of applause for Barclays, please. And then my clear text, Orla in the corner, who is a human, not a piece of software. She is creating the live captions that we see today. Has anybody not seen live captions before? Everyone has, it's good. Yes, excellent. Yes, so you'll know it's a magic keyboard and text. Okay. It's a magic person with a keyboard. So hang on, round of applause for Orla, thank you. And then Meetup video. So today we've got Peter and Janos from Meetup video. So they're at the back of the room running the live stream for us, and they provide us with the recordings of the sessions afterwards. Every time they seem to come here, we're wrestling with the Wi-Fi, and they always manage to fix it just in time, or just about on time. So please, big round of applause for Peter and Janos. Last thing before we get started, if you're on the toilet, they are back where you came in. So you go out the doors here, take a left, head up towards the lifts. Gents are on the left, ladies are on the right. Litter, please don't leave any litter in the auditorium. It's always really clean when we come in. So let's leave it the same when everyone goes home today. And then no plan fire drills. So if the fire alarm does go, it could be the real thing, so we need to leave promptly and safely. Again, we go out the doors here on my right, your left. We take a left up towards the lifts, and then just before the lifts, there are 2 staircases to head up towards the foyer where you came in. Okay, that is it from me. I'm going to pass over to Abi and just switch over to her slides. Yeah. 30 minutes, 35 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Right, so I'm going to be talking today about current state of accessibility regulations and what it means for professionals who are involved in the field of digital accessibility. So, first of all, I know Andy's already asked, but I'm going to ask who's here again, and I'm going to do the old-fashioned way first of all. Can anybody who is employed in central government put your hand up? And keep your hand up. Local government, keep your hand up. Public sector, funded by public in any way. Okay, right. Thank you so much for coming today on this important day. Keep your hands up because I want everybody else to give you a round of applause. Go on. Because today you had to comply with a certain set of regulations, which I'm going to be going into in some detail. But first of all, I'm going to ask you to do a quick poll on Slido, which if you put in the code, I think K209, not with a C, that's me typing something in directly, K209. I want to know where you've come from before you started working or being interested in accessibility, and hopefully that's not appeared on the screen. Oh, let me see if I can drag it over. Be good. There we go. So, people being involved. This is one of the things about accessibility. We come from all different types of backgrounds. I sometimes call myself a doctor. I am a PhD. I have a PhD in meteorology of all sorts of things. I didn't start as a developer, but I've done some coding, and basically I've spent the last 15 years working in assistive technology in accessibility. And that's pretty much what we find in this field. We all come from different backgrounds, and one of the things we have to now start thinking about even more is regulations and compliance. It's something we need to think about. So I'm going to finish that poll because we're a bit late on time. Just drag it back over. Ooh. There we go. All right. So I call myself an accessibility consultant. I have to say this before talking about regulations. I am not a lawyer. This does not constitute legal advice. Anything I say is not legal advice. Okay. So I'm an accessibility consultant, and I'm talking about regulations. Well, first of all, I'll tell you why I'm an accessibility consultant, and it's because nearly 30 years ago, this was my assistive technology. When I was 13, I was given this laptop, and yes, it was a laptop. It weighed 7 kilograms. I walked around like this. And that got me through my education, and in the end, I ended up working in assistive technology field. And why do I end up talking quite a lot about regulations and policy is 7 years ago, I was asked what I thought was a really simple question. One of the hats I wear is I work with the British Dyslexia Association, and I help them with technology questions. And I got a question which was really simple. At that time, they changed the rules with GCSE exams. You could use assistive technology instead of having a person sitting and reading you an exam. So I was asked, what text-to-speech program would work with these PDF versions of GCSE papers that were going to be given? Simple question, I thought. I know what TTS works with PDFs. Okay, give me some PDFs. So I got some PDFs that look like this. That's a 2012 GCSE paper. If you're not from the UK, we get these at the age 16, put on our desks, and we have to fill them in. And there's questions that look like this. So I ran it through a TTS, and this is the sort of thing that came out, a text-to-speech program, a really simple, basic one that relies on a clipboard that's free, so schools love it. And as you'll see there, it says, answer questions and 01, 02, 03, source A, the front cover of F, and then some gobbledygook at the end. And I thought, okay, technical test didn't work. Let's go to the standards route. Talk to the exam boards. These PDFs you're providing, are they accessible? The answer, they're on our website. No. Are they accessible? No, they're on our website. They had never heard of this concept of digital accessibility. To them, accessibility meant availability. They came from a print culture. Now, GCSE exams are regulated. Ofqual is the regulator. The government decides who's doing exams. 7 years later, if you ask me this question, whereas before it was like, oh, I don't know. Now it's, I don't really know. It really depends. It's still not great. But at least I do know who in the regulator I can go and tell if there's a problem, if I have a mistake. Because when it came down to it with all these questions, what happened was there could be whatever standards we liked, and we sat and wrote a standard with UCAF for exam boards. If the regulators didn't enforce it being used, it doesn't happen. So still, even now, a child can sit their GCSEs with a PDF exam and it might not work on the day because the regulators don't have any regulations that cover digital accessibility. Now, you might think that's a very specific case, that's education, you know, it's all political with exams. What about real life? I'm a lightweight assistive technology user. As long as I can change the fonts, I can change the font size, the colour, and I can use a keyboard on forms, I'm pretty much okay. So this is my local council. This is the website I have to use every time I come to London. And because we're at London Accessibility Meetup, I use Twitter. And at some point in the last 5 years, I've had accessibility problems with all those websites. I have nearly made a complaint about my council, but I like them. So I went and spoke to the IT person I know. But I have no guarantee that they will work. On the day, as an AT user, I don't know if they will work. And that's because, as we all know, it's wonderful having accessibility standards and WCAG and, you know, hands up, I'm part of WCAG, so I do write to those horrible guidelines. But without regulations, as an AT user, I can't guarantee it'll work. But, hey, digital accessibility regulations are increasing. So there's me with my AT user hat on going, it's great, there's more regulations in the world. And there's me as the professional going, there's more regulations in the world. But I don't think as professionals we should be concerned about there being more regulations. There's the jaded side of going, hey, there's regulations, we're a regulated industry, we're always going to have work, But likewise, it's good because it means that the field that we are working is being considered properly. It's something that is being considered important, and it's being recognised that however much we talk about the positive impacts of accessibility and the need to be inclusive, at the end of the day, it does have to happen, and somebody needs to make sure that me trying to book my train ticket or complain about a planning permission, I think it was, for my council, can actually fill that form in. Okay, so what regulations are out there? This is, as I said, I'm not a lawyer, a very potted timeline of the types of laws that affect us. So this timeline is non-discrimination laws, and we start in the 1990s with the ADA, which is the American one. Japan, UK had the Disability Discrimination Act in 1995, replaced by the Equality Act in 2010, and even now we've got less developed countries like India are passing non-discrimination rules. A lot of the recent regulation is because we've got the UNCRPD, Convention for Rights for People with Disabilities, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and both of those talk about making sure that information, education, employment and leisure are accessible and equal opportunities for people with disabilities. So I can see people taking photographs. I have tweeted my slides, so if you should there's a link to download my slides with all the links I forgot to mention. But the thing is with this Non-Discrimination Act, as I just said, given the situation with the exams, education should be accessible for everybody. Me as a user, I should be able to make a complaint about my planning. The Equality Act is all well and good, but you have to go through such a long process to actually get it enforced. And to be honest, if I can't book a train on Virgin Trains, I'll go to another company, thank you very much. I'm not going to bother going through all the process of complaining. So what about accessibility laws and regulations? Again, potted history, not everybody, but important here that those above the line are affecting private and public sector, and those below the line affect public sector only. So Japan, Video and Accessibility Act was the USA, Korea, and an example we use quite a lot, Norway, all require some accessibility standards to be followed by corporate organisations as well. One up here, taking note, yes, it's got the European word on it, but 2019 European Accessibility Act does require, in the next few years, e-commerce, e-books and e-banking to meet accessibility requirements, so that might impact us. Below the lines, USA Section 508, anybody involved in accessibility consultancy will know about 508, and this is the biggie for us. This is the one that actually today starts to have an impact. And that's why it's important today to understand what impact it is. And even Canada have come up with a federal level of laws. So we keep saying it's a really important day about accessibility. Why is it a really important day in the UK and the rest of Europe? It's across Europe. We were going to talk about some regulations called the Public Sector Bodies Website and Mobile Applications Accessibility Regulations 2018. Going to be called the regulations from now on. Okay, I have to talk about the B word. I'm really sorry. I have to. Brexit. Because this is, and it's really difficult because essentially this has come from an EU directive, which is called the EU Web Accessibility Directive, sometimes being called WAD. If you get onto any accessibility forums, you'll see this WAD, WADX. They came up with a directive requiring all member states to put in place legislation by September 2018. So that means this is now UK law. So whatever anybody says, that's the B word out the way, this is UK law. There is one line about reporting information to the EU, which might disappear, but everything else is UK law. It just happens that every member state is also doing the same thing. And we have to go back to the directive to understand what we're meant to be doing. So, what does it actually mean? It requires websites, intranet, online documents and mobile apps of public sector bodies to comply with the accessibility requirements. By intranet, they mean any website that is for a closed community, so behind a password. That is everything inside a web browser that's in an intranet. On mobile apps, yes, that actually means apps in app stores as well. It requires public sector bodies to have an accessibility statement. We'll go into that in more detail. And then finally, the big difference compared to where we're at with the Equality Act is the government has to monitor compliance with this as well. So whereas before we were reliant on people complaining and escalating that complaint potentially to the courts or EHRC, now the government has a role to play. And actually the European directive was set out with the intention that it would no longer require a disabled person to go and make that complaint, that the government would do that on their behalf. Who does it apply to? Publicly funded organisations, and it's based on the definition of publicly funded organisation that's covered by European procurement law, not the same as public sector duties in this description. So what do we think that means? Well, public sector organisations, there are some exemptions. Non-government organisations like charities, unless they provide essential public services, and schools and nurseries have a slight exemption, not a full exemption, except for the content the public need to access to use their services. You might be starting to feel now, oh my God, there's loads of words going up on the screen, I don't really understand it. Yeah, it gets a bit complicated and it's not easy to understand. Public sector broadcasts are also exempt, and that's because they're covered by the European Accessibility Act, and in the UK they already have accessibility duties. So that's all we've got on who it covers. That's all we're told. And then it talks about this accessibility requirement. Well, we're used to people going, you must comply with WCAG 2.0 level AA, or you must be 508 compliant. It suddenly talks about this accessibility requirement. And accessibility requirement, thankfully, is something we should be quite familiar with. Perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And what they've done is actually quite nice. In the regulations, they've just said, you've got to prove that you meet these perceivable, understandable, operable, understandable, and robust POR. And that means that if the standards change and develop as future technology changes and we move on to the next version of WCAG, etc., those actual top-level requirements stay the same. How do you prove you're meeting that accessibility requirement is slightly different. They have said you can do this by meeting the European Accessibility Standard, nicely named EN 301549, which has been aligned to WCAG 2.1 level AA. Now, when you access my slides, you'll find there's a link here that takes you to the latest version of 301549, which has nicely got a nice appendices, which gives you a table of all the criteria to match to these standards. And what you find out is it's not just WCAG. That EN 301549 has additional things like having accessible documentation and having help that talks about accessibility, and requirements for authoring tools, video players, biometrics, which are sort of in there within web accessibility content guidelines, but you sort of have to know how to put it into it. So yes, you can say you meet WCAG 2.1, not 2, 2.1 level AA, but also there is this additional standard as well. Okay, so next, why are we worrying about this today? Because of the timeline. So this came into law last September, but actually from today, if you published a website since last September, you had to make sure it met that accessibility requirement by today. Also, if you substantially revised your website, it had to meet by today. Also, new intranet and extranet content that is published after today needs to be accessibility compliant. It's gone very quiet. Everybody's gone quiet. Everything else, all other websites and updated intranet content, so if you then update your intranets, you then have to be compliant by next year, you've got another year, so you've got 12 months. And mobile apps, we've got 18 months. So in 18 months' time, mobile applications produced by public sector organisations need to be compliant. There's links. There's a link here to a site called letsthis.org.uk, which is a support site for university and higher educational institutions, but it's open to anybody. Myself and some colleagues who work with the HE and public sector have been putting the materials there, and there is an article where we try to unpick the timelines, because when it gets to things like documents and intranets, it's really complicated. But please feel free to look at that. And I mentioned you have to have an accessibility statement. Now, in your accessibility statement, you have to include certain things. It's quite prescriptive. The EU said it had to be quite prescriptive, and the government have published a model statement, and you have to follow it. You have to have a user-focused description. So you have to have a quite easy to understand, plain English, what does it mean in terms of accessibility? You have to have a statement of compliance, and you can say it's fully, partially, or not compliant. So you can absolutely openly admit, actually, we're not compliant. We don't meet accessibility requirements. But if you do, you have to say what parts of your service do not meet accessibility standards and why. And, question here, who to report accessibility problems to? Hands up again, who in the room knows who to talk to in your organisation if there's an accessibility problem? Oh, about 60%. You know what, if I do that to most people, it's about 10%. But you're probably in the room thinking, yeah, it's me. Yeah, so that's quite fun. And then you have to have information about the regulations and who to monitor them. So you have to put on this statement on your website in an easily to find place on every page who to complain to at the government if you don't meet these regulations. But now you're scared about that. Actually, this is a really good opportunity. This is an opportunity for us to reach out to our users and say, look, these are all the things we do on our website to help you, but if there are any problems, please contact us, and here's the nice people to contact, because, you know, I've been in website development. User feedback is good, even if it's bad. You know, we just want to know. And you can say things don't comply, and you can say what you're going to do about fixing it. And if things are difficult to make accessible, you can say, we'll give you an alternative format. You can be frank. It's about engaging with users. Quick thing about monitoring. GDS, Government Digital Services, are going to do it. This is what they've got to do according to the EU. Every year they're going to sample websites. They're going to find, and the sample size should be about 2,000 a year, they're going to go and look at in some way, possibly automatically, and maybe around 100 plus a year they're going to check in great depth audit. Yeah, haven't worked out how to do that, and most European countries are going, we don't know how to do all these numbers. But essentially this isn't just a tick box, you've got a statement, there will be some monitoring and there will be some checks going on what that means, and ultimately EHRC can do it. Does everything need to be accessible? No, actually it doesn't. Although we have to say you meet the accessibility requirements, there are exclusions. You can say it partially complies, and there's also something called disproportionate burden. And really what I take away from this, and guys at GDS and the accessibility team there have really taken the ethos, which I think is great for people like myself, is accessibility is a journey. If we say everybody has to comply, all those documents in PDF will just disappear. Everybody just go, no, turn them off, they're not accessible. We all understand the challenges, we find new technologies, they make a change to the browser, things break. But as long as we're working towards improvement, it's good. So what don't you have to make accessible? Documents that were published before last September, but think of all those documents you've published since then. Pre-recorded media, so videos you've got another year on. Live video, you don't have to worry about at all, it's excluded, but if you have a video that you put up live and then keep it up there for 14 days, it becomes pre-recorded. So if you put a website up, live broadcast, has to be captioned within 14 days. Captions and audio descriptions. Maps are excluded. Third-party content we will come back to, and old websites. So they have this other thing about claiming disproportionate burden. Disproportionate burden allows you to say it's going to cost me too much to fix this. But it's not you and it's not your team's cost, it's the cost to your whole organisation. So if you run a big organisation, You can't necessarily claim this is going to be too much work for me. But you also can look at the benefits, the number of people. If it's a really old set of PDFs that nobody visits versus a YouTube video that's on your homepage, how many people are going to access those things? So you can take into account and say some things are too much work. Oh, there's a spelling mistake. It's time limited. You can't claim for the next 5 years that it's too much work. In the next 2-3 years, somebody might come along and go, well, hang on, you've had 3 years to fix this now. You've got to come back and look at it. And you have to put all of this into your accessibility statement. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to rush. Unanswered questions. These are things we don't know what they mean in the regulations, and I mean it. A website. So the regulations say when you publish a website, when you update your website, there is no legal definition of what is a website. Is it a subdomain included in the whole website? If it's on a different server and package at the back end, do I have a different accessibility statement or not? So at the moment, there are still quite a few unanswered questions about how we actually implement these regulations. Yes, they've come into practice today. We have to do things about them. But actually, what that means in practice is still unknown. And the HE sector has actually looking at some legal advice. They've engaged with lawyers to try and get these types of terminology sorted out. Because if documents, active administrative purposes, means something like a PDF that is your annual accounts or report, that's in active administration. All those ones that were published before 2018 have to be accessible. That's quite a big piece of work. And a website means quite a lot. Probably a lot of you sitting there going, hang on, I'm not in public sector. Why have I sat through this talk? I don't really care. Does this apply to me? Well, according to the government, all UK service providers have a legal obligation to make reasonable adjustments under the Equality Act, including making their websites accessible. Neglecting to provide a web service to a disabled person that is normally provided to other people could be considered indirect discrimination. And the public sector accessibility regulations say a failure to comply is a failure to make a reasonable adjustment. So, are you going to risk whether you consider yourself public sector or not? And essentially, when you go through the government papers, when they were putting this regulations in front of Parliament, they said, this isn't any more work for public sector bodies because they should have been already doing it. The only thing that is new is the statement and the monitoring. What about third-party content? What does control mean? If you purchase a website off a third-party supplier that is private sector, you are responsible for the accessibility. If you purchase content, if you commission it in any sense, or you customize it, then you're responsible for it. So if you are a company that supplies into the public sector, you need to think about your accessibility because you're going to start getting those questions when people purchase of you. Things that are exempt are things like user-generated content and social media fields and likewise that. Basically, if you can influence the accessibility of content as a public sector, you are liable for it not being accessible. I'm going to skip that. Accessibility regulations may lead to wider culture change. I'm really pleased. I'm an advocate, but I'm also an accessibility professional, both sides. I think it's going to be great. I'm really pleased. I'm not worried. I'm not worried about, even if it's really complicated. Transparency. We can actually say, hey, we've got a few problems with our accessibility, but we're going to fix it. It's going to be great. Public expectations. People are going to expect things to be accessible. We can actually get people to understand the benefits of making websites accessible. And for those of us who are, thinking, how am I going to get my senior managers to engage and actually spend some money and publish this statement even? Reputational risk. Is it worse to say your website is not accessible on a statement or not publish a statement? Because if you haven't got an accessibility statement there, it's very easy to find. As my colleague who's sitting over there, George Rhodes, found out when he spent the last couple of weeks looking at websites. And he checked all local authority sites and universities and fire and police services. And of the 600 odd sites, he found 23 accessibility statements that met the requirements of the accessibility regulations. That figure's probably changed, and you're going to update it, aren't you, George? 24, hey! But even partially complying, 25% are sort of getting there. So we've got a big problem with actually people might have heard a little bit about the regulations, but they're not there yet. And we need to get people thinking seriously and engaging with it, because there are members of the public and there are disability groups and people like NUS who are going to start talking about this quite seriously and pushing it forward. Key requirements, how are we going to do this? How do we get our organisations to engage with web accessibility regulation? Training. We need to train our staff internally and externally as well. We need to make sure we're upskilled and our staff internally upskilled. Looking back at like other countries where they have had similar regulations, they say the things that are really key in making sure regulations like this work and we don't end up in court is clear understanding of coverage of who it covers, the type of content and the technical standards. If you've heard about the Supreme Court case in the US with Domino's, yes, taking it. That's because Domino's are arguing that because there aren't any standards in the law, they don't need to comply. So that is why we all need to have a clear understanding. If you have questions, raise them with the government. Please do. We have been doing it for months and months and months. If you don't understand why, please tweet, email, ask them, because we need to get examples of best practice, both code, as in how do we make this accessible, and how do we do it within an organisation. So final question, and this is slightly leading into my colleague, Sarah from Southampton. Do we have the right skills to do this? And that's why I asked that question at the beginning of whether we were developers or not. We all come from really mixed backgrounds. And the problem is people see these regulations and think, oh, we're just going to end up like in the States. It's just going to be compliance and, we're going to be sued. Oh, no. And we end up in this pass-fail culture. But actually, because of the accessibility statement and because we can be open about our accessibility journey, that's what we're being asked to do, we need to take on more of an advocacy role and start writing accessibility roadmaps. That's actually what GDS are recommending. Publish an accessibility roadmap. It's great. But to do that, we need to develop communities of practice, such as this. It's great. Professional recognition. Okay, we're writing these statements. We have to put whether something complies or not. We have to do audits or some type of checks. Are we qualified to do that? IAAP is great. And understanding what good looks like. Do we actually know what a good accessible website looks like in all the permutations from everything from NHS, local government, public government, universities, schools, GP surgeries, museums, charities, all these things that now have to comply. So I think it's important that we start talking in terms of regulations and not being scared about it as well. Just before we go to questions, because I think I have a few minutes for questions, there are some resources there. As I said, I've tweeted about this. Flagging up TechShare Pro, which is being run by my colleagues at AbilityNet, and they've got a discount code there for anybody from Accessibility Meetup for 25% off. That's a great opportunity to meet other organisations and talk about accessibility, and we will be talking about the regulations and further details. There is an email forum run by JISC, focused on HE, but welcome anybody from the public sector if you've got questions as well. Oh, breathe. There we go. Tweet me, email me as well. Thank you. Have a good.
Okay, you got a couple of questions on
Yep.
the website. Is anyone in the audience that has a question? Couple. Okay. These are your website ones.
Oh, shall I read one of those out before while you're wondering about, okay, this is where I need the assistive technology. What about content posted on Twitter and LinkedIn? If generated by the public sector body on their channels, do they need to comply? Oh, wow. If it's content that you have created and is under your control, then yes, it needs to comply, because control means you have control over it, your account and Twitter. Shall I do the second one from here? If we find a new public sector website that refuses to comply, is there going to be an easy way to tip off GDS to pile pressure on the website? Right, so GDS they tell users how to complain through the Quality Advisory Service. They will also have a stakeholder group that will inform them who to do the monitoring of. When that stakeholder group is appointed, I assume those people will start talking about that, and that will be a route in, but it's likely to be representatives from disability groups as well. So yeah, start talking to your stakeholder groups, who represents you, and making sure with that channel in, and yeah, email, tweet them. Say, hey, come on, You should be doing your job. Hey, questions from the audience?
Hi, Jakub from the Home Office. So great talk, thank you very much. So the Home Office have taken the view that although it's not explicitly put in the regulations that this is for internal and external audiences, that we should be doing it for both. But I haven't seen anywhere it written down that as a public sector organisation, you have to do this internally. So is that going to be clarified?
Okay, so it says intranets and extranets are included, and I have a quote here. The notes. I actually have the person who wrote this in the room as well, so I have to be careful I get it right. Basically, intranets and extranets, so that includes documents or anything that is internally located. So,
but is that a service as well? So if there's I'll give an example. There's a car parking
yes.
rotor.
Yeah. So essentially, I mean, that's the question. If you move your HR system to an online system from software, it suddenly comes under the remit of the regulations. If it's in a browser, it's covered.
Okay, thanks.
According to GDS. And there was a second question at the back, I think. Yeah. Have we got a mic?
Thank you very much. We're finding that we're working with a lot of local authorities, and their third-party suppliers are essentially just ignoring us. They don't care. We either have to pay thousands and thousands of pounds, or they're not going to do it. Have you found that there is essentially a way around this? Can we try and force them, because it's not covered in the legislation that's there at the moment?
So I think this is again about community coming together. You can claim disproportionate burden if they are your only supplier, the only person that you could do that, but you would have to have some type of plan of how to remove that accessibility issue. So if they are the only product that is suitable, you could claim that it is a disproportionate burden to fix that. But likewise, this is about procurement and actually establishing accessibility as part of your procurement process, and building that in and saying to them, well, if it's going to cost us £10,000 to fix the accessibility on your product, you are costing us £10,000 more, so you're not good value anymore. I hope, particularly across Europe, if we start to see this actually all join up, it will put pressure on them. But at the moment, please do go and knock on the door of your procurement people and say, if you don't buy accessible stuff, you're paying for it.
Possibly open one question to the floor. Has anyone found a local authority provider a payment provider for a local authority that is accessible? That scares me, in all honesty.
Go and talk to George Road, who sits over here, who used to work for Kent County Council, because he has a document about procurement to follow and a process of that. It's available on this website here, lexis.org.uk/digital accessibility. There's a whole toolkit of things that were developed with Kent County Council, Kent University, other universities. So lots of templates and things for local governments that can use in there, including about procurement. There's another question over there if there's time. But I'll break. I'm happy to answer questions at break.
Thank you so much, Abi.
Thank you.
So we have a break for 30 minutes now to give all that a break, and there should also be some drinks and maybe pizza left. So if you want to come back about 8:15, then we'll have our second talk. Guys, if you want to grab your seats. That's right. Okay, welcome back everyone. Hope you managed to get some food and drink in the break. So the second talk this evening is Dr. Sarah Lewthwaite from the University of Southampton, who's going to be talking about learning and teaching accessibility. So I'll hand straight over to Sarah.
Hello everybody, thank you very much for joining me on the late shift. I really appreciate you sticking with me and being here with me this evening. I'm Sarah Lewthwaite. I'm based at the University of Southampton, specifically in the Centre for Research in Inclusion, and that is based within Southampton School of Education. So I am not located within computer sciences, I'm located within an education school, I'm an educational researcher. But the thing you should know about Southampton is we do teach web accessibility in our programs. We have a web accessibility team led by Professor Mike Wold with other esteemed colleagues. And education is kind of a computer science sandwich at Southampton. We have computer science upstairs, we have computer science downstairs, and the middle floor is education. So we knock into each other quite a lot. I'm here because I've recently won some funding from UKRI as part of their Future Leaders Fellowship. And I'm now Principal Investigator on a project called Teaching Accessibility in the Digital Skill Set. And this is a 4-year project investigating the teaching and learning of accessibility. So a few points to clarify up front. I'm not talking about teaching in an accessible way. This is not about generic teaching and making that teaching accessible, although obviously that relates to what we do. I'm talking about how people gain the accessibility capabilities, competencies that constitute professional expertise, be that undergraduate, postgraduate, or in the workplace. So obviously, Abi's talk finished with a lot of talk about gaining the right skills and the importance of training, and this being a key step for all of us. And one of my observations as an educationalist is there was a lot of talk of more, that we should all be doing more, extending our professionalism, we should be training each other, teaching each other, but not how. And I think this how question is really important. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to talk about. The challenge. I'm a researcher, I'm researching accessibility education. Why is that important? Part 2, I'm going to talk about the evidence. That is the current state of research on the teaching of accessibility. And then I'm going to talk part 3 about the future, where we go next, how you can help me, and how I can help you. So, number 1, the challenge. We've heard a bit about the accessibility skills gap. Most of you aware of the Teach Access initiative in the US? Hands up if you are aware. Okay, yeah, sort of a couple of people. Teach Access is a kind of Silicon Valley-led initiative, industry-led, started a couple of years back because they were really struggling to recruit people with accessibility expertise. And so the initiative was kind of set about trying to encourage universities in various ways to embed accessibility in their teaching of computer science. And this PeteWorks infographic, if you go on the website following this link, my slides will be available later, you'll be able to access a text equivalent of this infographic. The infographic details all sorts of industry comment from a significant survey they did on basically the lack of skills, that they were trying to recruit people, or when they do recruit people, they're having to do a lot of onboarding about accessibility, they're having to upskill people when they come through the door. That basically, when they come to recruit people, they say, what do you know about accessibility? And people say, nothing. So this is, in many respects, quite shocking. So the business case is kind of there. We've heard about the legislative case, there's a moral case, there's an ethical case. We all need to know more about accessibility. So where does learning about accessibility take place? So here, I think when we did a survey and show of hands earlier, there were about 5-ish people who put their hands up to say They were from education. So I'm going to sort of widen the question now. My first question is, how many of you currently teach or train or upskill teams on accessibility? Oh, so that's about a third. Great. And my next question is, how many of you have had any teacher training? And that's sort of 3 or 4. Great. That's really helpful. So in terms of learning accessibility, how many of you have had a formal accessibility education? So maybe it was covered in your degree programs or you've done IAAP certification. I think I'm right in saying that's 1 person. 2, 3. Do I see 4? Okay, so there's a little formal education going on. So that gestures, I think, to the importance of informal learning in this space. So events like this, where people get together and learn. There's also exciting things like the Accessibility Internet Rally. Have any of you heard of that? That's run by Knowability. They get teams to enter, and each team is responsible then for generating an accessible website for a not-for-profit or a charity or educational organisation. Obviously, there are accessibility hackathons. Those, again, can be great for building expertise in a kind of problem-based environment. And then, of course, you've got the W3C Web Accessibility Initiative materials. You've got webinars. You've got MOOCs, the massive online open courses that places like Southampton run. So there are things happening. But as I say, in amongst the talk of the need for more training, there isn't much discussion of pedagogy. Right, pedagogy is a word I'm really happy to say really quickly, because I come from an education department. But I'm aware it's not in common parlance. But I want you all to leave this room and feel like you can say pedagogy and that you're comfortable with that. And then at the end, we'll all high five. Pedagogy describes method, theory, and practice of teaching and learning. It's what happens in educational teacher training, investigating what pedagogy is in all its different richness and beauty. So for an example, in an environment like this, where we've got a really diverse audience, I don't really know you very well, and I'm trying to understand where to pitch what I'm talking about, a quick early step is to do a show of hands on a few different topics. And you've seen other speakers use it. That's a way of then orientating the speaker or the educator towards the audience. We might call that student-centered learning, a student-centered learning approach. That allows me then to pitch what I'm talking about, select what language I want to use, build difficulty in a more targeted way. These are all kind of pedagogic steps. So pedagogy can be really important for a lot of reasons. So, now let's turn to accessibility specifically. And I think the first thing to say is that teaching accessibility is challenging. My observations from the literature, which I'm going to talk about, is that accessibility requires a quite unique mix of factors. First relates to conceptual understanding. So this might be about theoretical conceptions and understandings of disability. So you'll sometimes see speakers introduce a social model of disability to move the audience maybe from an individualized or medical perspective to one that's more nuanced and understands about the barriers that disabled people can face, be they social or structural. So it touches on some of these conceptual domains that might be more social scientific. It also involves procedural knowledge. That is, thinking about the expert decision-making process that is necessary to strategically deliver accessibility. And then there's also the technical competence, the actual technical skills that you then need to collect and be able to articulate. And at the same time, there are a lot of pedagogical challenges for teachers. For example, we're all well aware of the changing technological context. Often events like this are a chance to just keep abreast of changes. So for example, also in legislation. Disability itself is also quite a variable subject. So understandings about impairment, types of impairment and so forth change. And they're socially constructed, so they can look quite different in different parts of the world, in different environments and different contexts. There's a lack of formal curriculum and formalised learning objectives for teachers in formal settings like universities, and there can also be a lack of visibility outside of HCI. And where we get into pedagogy, and my project and what I'm trying to do, is thinking about pedagogic content knowledge, and also a lack of pedagogical culture. And these 2 points I'm going to address in turn. So the first question is, what is pedagogic content knowledge? Those of us who've had a bit of educational training and teacher training may be very familiar with this, so bear with me. Pedagogic content knowledge marries generic pedagogic activities, like making eye contact, speaking clearly, general pedagogical approaches, maybe like student-centered learning, that I mentioned earlier, with specific content. So that is the accessibility knowledge. So what we want to do is try and find what pedagogical approaches articulate this content best. And this is described as pedagogic content knowledge. Right, are we comfortable with that? Are we going to nod, or are we going to be like, no, I don't know, Sarah, talk about it some more? Pedagogic content knowledge was first coined by Schulman in 1986. And he observes that educators may be strong in content knowledge, for us that might be accessibility expertise, but lack pedagogic knowledge. That is a rich teaching repertoire that can be applied to accessibility. And I think this is a problem for a lot of domains where there's cutting edge knowledge. Because the people who acquire that cutting edge knowledge are then required, oh yeah, you've got to tell us all how to do that, which can be a real challenge. And I've seen this happen in other domains. For example, cutting edge research methods. So, around like the use of machine learning for qualitative research approaches and so on. You've got to work, well, that creation of new pedagogy for new spaces is challenging. The other issue can often be that pedagogy may be implicit or unreflected. So this can be called invisible pedagogy, because I'll bet the majority of you have certain ways of doing what you do in terms of training. There are things marks you need to hit to get people to come around to what you're thinking and understand the kind of accessibility mindset. But we don't always have time and space to reflect on what those steps are. And if we can't name them, it's then very difficult to bring them into dialogue with our colleagues and peers and say, I'm doing this, what are you doing? And then kind of build the knowledge together. So pedagogic content knowledge is important, and I think the naming of pedagogy and the approaches you use for education is also important, so we can then talk about what we're doing and build that knowledge. So that's one of the problems, I think, particularly sort of in professions, but the flip side is also a challenge in universities. So Shinohara et al., 2018, who are based at Rochester Institute of Technology, they talk to a lot of university faculty, and the faculty are facing challenges. They might have the pedagogic knowledge, but they don't necessarily have the content knowledge. They don't feel confident teaching accessibility. They don't feel like they have the expertise. So clear challenges that they expressed, let me see, this is, I think this is a survey of 352 institutions, and they found that around half had one instructor, at least one instructor teaching accessibility. And I'll just, I'll read something from one of the paper that's linked here, which is open access. They state, faculty that teach accessibility are twice as likely to be female, to have expertise in HCI and software engineering, and to know people with disabilities. The most critical barriers to teaching accessibility that faculty reported were the absence of clear and discipline-specific accessibility learning objectives and a lack of faculty knowledge about accessibility. Faculty desired resources that were specific to the areas of computing in which they teach, rather than general accessibility resources and guidelines. And again, I think this is gestures to another challenge for the field, which is that much of our training is kind of 101, accessibility basics. And there's a gap then about what other levels of accessibility expertise and the routes through to them would look like. So let's have a little look at the evidence. The first piece of work that my project's undertaken is to look at the status quo, what research there is to do scoping work. And Abi's been looking at the policy dimension of that, and I've been looking at the literature with my colleague Andy Coverdale. We've done a systematic review of the literature. So this is quite a precise methodological approach. We've searched 20 years of research from 1999 to the present across two major databases. This is Scopus and Web of Science. And to do this, you create different domains in the literature. You create the accessibility domain, digital accessibility, with all our search terms relating to that, which came to about 14,000 titles returned. And then we create our education domain, which returned about 3.2 million titles. And then when you overlap them to find out where the papers about teaching accessibility are, you end up with about 2,000 papers. Now, as Abi mentioned earlier, of course, accessibility doesn't always mean accessibility. Sometimes people just mean availability, so you cut away those papers. Next, you turn up a literature which is about how to teach in an accessible way. And that's a substantial literature all of its own because, of course, disability, discrimination, legislation and the Equality Act and so forth, all the legislation that you've seen in previous slides from Abi has been in force in education for a long time. So there is actually quite a substantial literature about how to teach in accessible ways. So we're gradually cutting away different elements of the literature. Then we combined the findings of the different papers from Scopus. We got 71 titles in our shortlist. Next, we did the forward and backward citation analysis. That's when you go through every paper and you look at what it cites and whether you've already captured it. So who's cited it recently, who does it cite, and you add those all into the melting pot as well. That brought our numbers back up a little bit. But then you get to the final sift. And this is about the quality of the papers and how closely they meet our research questions. And as I say, this is about how we teach accessibility. So not sort of observations about course design unless they have some part that's about the how. And methodology is important here as well. So we're not looking for anecdotal reflections. We're looking for methodologically developed research. And this led us to about 24 papers, and we're still just on the edge of that. This is a little bit of my search string. Just a tiny, tiny fraction. It's got like 17 moves in it, and we're going to publish it. Yeah, this is the other thing I want to say. We're going to be publishing the methodology, including our search string, so people can use it to search for new literature on top of the literature we've found, and basically make it a reproducible literature review, hopefully to save other researchers time as they're trying to look at this kind of literature. So what do we find? It's an emergent literature. It's small, 24 papers across 20 years. It's not a lot of papers. It's also relatively fragmented, and there's a lack of systematic debate and investigation and cross-citation, evaluating of each other's work and sort of the principles that people are generating. So we would say this is indicative of kind of a lack of pedagogical culture, because we really want to see more networking around the teaching and learning of accessibility and that kind of scrutiny of what we're saying to bring it up to a stronger and more rigorous kind of debate. The majority of papers comprise teachers' reflections on their own practice and their own course design. So there's not a lot of cross-case research, which again has a knock-on effect for what we can say from the literature. And there's also quite a lot of individual accounts of best practice. And I don't know how you feel about best practice, but given that, as I say, there's not a huge research base we're drawing from here, I always feel quite unsteady about best practice. We can kind of gravitate towards creating best practices, but if they're anecdotally grounded, that can actually restrict how creative we are in our teaching approaches. So if somebody gives you any best practices, I want you to just don't let that stop you being creative in what you're trying to do and to explore new ways of doing with your teaching. The other thing is it changes over time. Early papers were really focused on awareness raising. I think we recognise that this is a tenet of accessibility teaching, connecting students, connecting learners to what disability is, what standards might be, really trying to just connect them to the fundamentals of the topic. And this is part of the literature that goes right across the piece, so onto into contemporary literature too. The next stage focuses largely on curriculum development. So this is a discussion about trying to embed it in teaching and trying to get it recognised in the curriculum. Again, not necessarily deeply into the pedagogy side. And then the contemporary literature, I think, is really promising. This is where we are starting to see cross-case research and people grappling with some of the more difficult aspects of accessibility literature, accessibility practice. So, other initial themes. There's the use of tools and how that relates to teaching and building skills. We see a lot of active pedagogies, of course, using things like learning by doing, focusing on problem and project-based learning. Again, there's a lot about how we embed accessibility and also involve people with disabilities in the teaching and learning of accessibility. There's also this touching on approaches understood to facilitate empathy. And again, I sort of gesture to these while saying it's a small literature. So going forward, I think there's a real need. Before I do go forward, I want to say the literature review, the papers that I've discussed, they're all available on the website. If you go to teachingaccessibility.ac.uk/library. So the papers are all there. Some of you might be able to access all of them if you have academic logins. About half are open access. So I think it's really important that we build and develop pedagogical culture. This is about us getting together all over the place, not just in academia, but in places like this, to say, okay, this is a learning community. It could also be a teaching community, that we can get together and discuss how we go about teaching. And it can also be a research community, that these three things are actually really closely bound. So I want you to leave this room thinking, maybe if you don't have that identity of being a teacher, but that maybe you can be an educator, that you are a trainer, that even everyday conversations about accessibility can be educational conversations. I think there's a need to connect disciplines and share research beyond the academy. That's why I'm here. And I'm looking forward to extending the literature we have available by starting to push into other domains. So, for example, what does disability research have to say about raising awareness of disability, and how can we use that? How can we pinch areas of research and add them into our kind of bag of tricks? I think it's also important that we create diverse research and teaching spaces. So again, this might be one, but have a think about where you would like to see that. For example, some papers have been published at the Assets conference, but Assets is now, I think for the first time this year, solicited teaching papers. So one of the problems for people who write about accessibility, teaching and learning is where do you then put that? How do you share what you've done? And will you, in fact, get any reward? In academia, you'll get far more kudos if you're a computer science lecturer for publishing computer science papers than you will for publishing education papers. So this is a problem. And then I think it's also important we do additional cross-case research, and that's what I'll be doing over the next 3 or 4 years. So for me, I'll be doing more thematic analysis, deeper, wider. I'm going to be maintaining this living collection of the research, which I've mentioned. And I'm also going to be exploring how we can document and share effective teaching methods and build links with related projects and people like you. So if this is an area that you feel really strongly about, or if you're really wanting to do new things or share what you're already doing, please do get in touch. And I really mean it. Please do get in touch. Call me. Call me. I'm doing a call me sign. I'm holding like my hand up like a phone, and I'm saying call me. So what am I doing going forward? We've got expert panel methods. I'm going to be using case studies that use video-stimulated dialogue. So going into the field, beyond what people say about teaching, to see what they actually do in new and innovative locations, as well as education situations, as well as informal situations. I'm going to be also then taking what knowledge we've collected and trying to apply it in practice settings using participatory action research. That is a very quick overview. A couple of things that are coming up that I want to draw to your attention is firstly, there's an accessible curriculum forum that the Institute of Coding are hosting on Monday in London. I think a few places are still available if you're interested in going to that. And I'm also going to be talking at Inclusive Design 24. Here I've been talking about the accessibility literature. At Inclusive Design 24, I'm going to talk about education, pedagogic principles that are well established in education and how they resonate for accessibility for professionals, teachers, trainers, educators. So do tune in, put it in your diary. I think it's going to be a great day anyway. Okay, and that's me. Thank you. I'll make all the slides available. There's your further reading class. You've got your references, you've got your homework, you know what to do.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you.
Any questions in the audience?
I've got someone over there.
Okay. One here as well.
I've got a question here which says, is there a best way to teach very subjective areas? For example, is it discriminatory? What is reasonable? I'm not quite sure what the questioner means by that. But I would say that education around disability awareness can be a sensitive topic, and it can be difficult to teach. In terms of disability awareness, I don't think it ever should be discriminatory. If you are uncertain about it and you're within an educational organisation, do talk to your disability support people who will do in-house training for their disability support staff. I don't know, what's your take on that question?
I didn't actually hear the question, sorry.
At the bottom. Is it discriminatory?
Yeah. I'm not
If they can send a slight clarification, and I'll take another question, we can come back. What's the question, please?
It's a personal question. I'm wondering, how did you get to this place of studying all this stuff and wanting to learn about all these things?
Well, I'm glad you asked me. My journey's been quite a long and meandering one. I've worked in special needs support and disability support and in universities, as well as doing web accessibility in one of those careers that's going in different ways. I became really interested in online learning, e-learning, at that moment when the UK government was pushing it quite hard, but at the same time we had the Disability Discrimination Act coming in. So what I saw as somebody supporting students and being involved in higher education was that there were lines of legislation coming into effect that were going to intersect, and it didn't seem to me that people were thinking about that. So that precipitated me doing a PhD at the Learning Sciences Research Institute at Nottingham. Do we still have the Nottingham people in the house? A up my ducks. And that became, I was aware that there was research about online learning, and there's some brilliant things being done by the likes of Jane Seal, who's now at the Open University and so on. But whilst I was looking at that area, I became interested in the ways technologies were adopted by education and exploited sometimes for business ends, and that the disability conversation tended to come a long way downstream. So my PhD became about social media and disability, and looking at what was then quite new, Facebook, and how the use of Facebook changed experiences of a kind of disabled subjectivity. Being within education and then spinning out different lines of thought from my PhD, I suddenly reached this place where it's like, hang on, this doesn't have to be just about an accessible education. What do I know that I can use to start to explore what I think is the next step for us as a field? Yeah, we know we need more training, we know we need more education. What's it going to look like, and who's going to give us that knowledge, given this status quo where computer science teachers aren't necessarily rewarded for, as I say, publications or sharing knowledge, or cross-case research is difficult to articulate. And then there's personal reasons as well about, experiences and friends and, the stuff that makes us committed to the field. So.
Do you think there's space within the education system for faculties to learn accessibility, and would an e-learning platform be valuable to that kind of arena?
It's an interesting point. I mean, like all faculty has to do a equality and diversity training. What I found interesting about recent legal changes in terms of some of the committees responsible, say, for the digital offering that universities give, is that accessibility is coming up, and it's not always me that's raising it. So I think a lot of senior teaching staff are aware of the issues. Of course, if you teach and you've got disabled students, you may have disabilities yourself as faculty, you're wanting to make the best offering possible. And there's awareness of accessibility issues is percolating through, I think. In terms of accessibility training, I'm sure if Abi hadn't had to dash for a train, yes, there is an ongoing issue for educational institutions, that there's this shared endeavour that is accessibility, and it's got to run all the way through. It can't just be the site, it can't just be the learning platform, it has to be the content, it has to be the teaching resources, and then it has to be how they're delivered. So it runs across the piece. And as I say, there is growing literature and resources for teachers about making their materials accessible. We've had a few forward and backward moments, because I know when JISC TechDis went, that was quite a strong location for people to get advice on creating accessible documents, etc. So sometimes we move forward and we move backward. But I think there is a will there, generally. But that, I don't want to say that everybody's great. I'm sure we've got colleagues we all need to work on as well.
Thank you very much. It'd be nice to catch up with you later.
Thank you.
Hi there.
Hello.
I was wondering, are you trying to arrive at something that would amount to a kind of, existing kind of curriculum structure, kind of course, guidelines, materials, that kind of thing? Or is this something that's taught in a bit more of a different way, in that it's kind of a bit more organic, and that it's the nature of teaching and learning has changed, and so you get a lot more influences from a lot more different sources, and so is there sort of is that also kind of something that you're looking at?
I think when I sort of brought my bid together, I was talking about a learning ecology, because I know I still need to understand more about the different kinds of accessibility education. It's not a homogeneous set, obviously. There are different roles in industry, and there's different skill sets associated with those, and also different types of education that, so education in engineering and software development and then user experience, potentially going to be quite different spheres. And they might have quite different traditions in terms of the legacies of their pedagogy and different expectations of students. So I want to be quite open about that, but what I do need is input from people like you about these are the kind of planets that have a gravitational pull in these kind of spaces. So if I'm going to run an expert panel, should it be top academics who've been teaching a long time, or should I be talking to people who do a lot of teaching in the private or in industry, and then how they go about teaching? There are different ways of coming at it, and that's what I really need to work out with your help. So I've got plans, obviously, but at the same time, I appreciate input. And I should say that my advisory group's really helpful. So I've got Larry Goldberg from the Teach Access programme. He's one of the founders there. I've got people like David Sloan from the Paciello group, who's also been teaching in computer science at Dundee in the past, Abi, and others who are going to give me some of that insight. But I'm also aware that something I haven't touched on a lot is accessibility to older people. And I think because my background's sort of disability specific, I need to make sure that I don't miss what is a growing area where there's a real need for understanding and then articulating that understanding.
Thank you, James from Home Office. Thanks very much for the talk. First of all, you're very welcome to come and observe the training that we do in-house, if that would be useful.
I will be there.
Thank you. We've trained over 300 members of staff and people across government as well, and I know that GGS have sort of trained further cohorts of people. And we obviously asked them to fill like an evaluation form out at the end. Do you have any suggestions on what kind of data we should be collecting to sort of assess the impact, and would it be useful if that was standardised in some way to help your research?
Oh, that'd be really interesting and good to do, because student feedback can be very weak methodologically. Sometimes it can be just satisfaction. Did you like it? Did you not like it? I'm a fan of engagement methods where you talk about what people brought to the training as well as what they get. I believe, education is not something that happens to you. It's something you have to be actively involved in. So evaluation approaches that establish that the engagement, but also what people will then do with the knowledge or the skills or capacity that they've gained, I think would be really useful. But I'd like to hear more about what it is you do and how, but then potentially, yes, there could be sort of a kind of formative assessment that might be useful for you in terms of developing the teaching, but also for me in terms of, collecting data. Yes, please. Thank you very much. I've got, somebody's taking it all down, so it's like, it's in writing, so I'm very happy about that.
Excuse me.
Hello.
I got one quick question.
Yeah.
Basically, I'm not a professional or expert in accessibility. I'm just the end user, and I wanted to understand. I wanted to learn how to learn.
Yeah.
Do you ever deal with or talk to end users? Just the everyday users.
It's an interesting question, in the sense that I think users are, of course, like the key stakeholder for the research, because at the end of the day, the whole point of considering the teaching of accessibility is that then people who create tools, that they improve, and people are digitally included as a result. So the research that is involving disabled people's organisations at an advisory and consultative level. But in terms of the actual research and recognising user perspectives, not so much, actually. It's more focused on the people who are who are teaching and how their skills are developed. Although I also recognise that teachers, it's not a matter of one group being disabled or not disabled, that's teachers of accessibility are also going to be.
Can I just quickly ask another follow-up question?
Yeah, sure.
Is there a place where, just as I said, normal users, disabled users can go to learn which technology to use? Of course, I get confused and it's hard to research. I get exhausted. Is there a place like just for...
That's a really good question. Does anybody have anything they'd like to... Yeah. Yeah, that's AbilityNet, My Web, My Way.
Okay.
So do go to this, abilitynet.org, and have a look at their resources.
Thank you for that.
Okay, that's it. Right, thanks everybody. Thanks very much.
So that's it today. Thank you all so much for coming. I know the weather wasn't very good, so I appreciate you coming out tonight and spending the evening with us. I hope you all learned something new. Just wanted to do a couple of quick announcements before we go. So Sarah already mentioned this, but I'll just mention it again. ID24 is a really good online event that's coming up in about 2 weeks. It's worth checking out. So the website is inclusivedesign24.org. It's 24 hours of online talks, one of which will be Sarah's. And then I wanted to do a mention for Accessibility Nottingham, which is a fairly new meetup, right? How old is it, guys? 6 months, okay. Happy 6 months. So their next event is October the 15th, I think. So yeah, the organisers are at the back. If you want to say hello, very nice group of people. Amazing new website. I'm a bit jealous, but well done. Yeah, so the other thing is just say thank you to all the organisers. So this event doesn't happen, it's not just me that does this. I've got Raf from Sainsbury's, who's not very well today, but he did stay to help everything get set up, and then he went home. So thank you, Raf. We have Catherine as well from Sainsbury's, and then we also have a guy called Ben, who's not here as well today. But yeah, it's a team effort, so please give the organisers a round of applause. Then just final call for litter, please. Make sure you pick up anything that you brought in with you, and we're done. We will try and get October dates out to you ASAP, especially you. But thank you so much for coming, guys.